Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Harder They Fall from 2021. Now, this movie caught my eye some time ago, about the time when it came out, because it is a Netflix release primarily. And if you're on Netflix or any other streaming service for that matter, you really just, things flit across your vision as they're recommended to you. You can't really avoid that much. Which, when it comes to things like Netflix, I'm often actually happy because there's things that I would not have come across otherwise. And in the case of this movie in particular, I'm kind of glad. Well, partially glad and partially concerned that it's only on Netflix, because this is a out of the ordinary enough film that I could see it not necessarily doing as well in traditional theatrical release, but also it worries me a little bit that anything of that ilk ends up relegated to direct to streaming services at this point. It doesn't necessarily mean what it used to sort of mean when things would go direct to video, those sorts of things. I only hope that it does not hamper the growth of smaller artists and narratives that are non-traditional, and does not accidentally continue the trend of Hollywood only being full of super traditional narratives made by big names. Anyway, part of the reason this caught my eye in the first place is because it's a Western. It looks like a Western from its title and screenshots, and the entire cast, or at least on the advertising screens, is entirely non-white, which is very unusual for a whole bunch of reasons. It's unusual in general to even see a movie, even in current year, that has a primarily or solely non-white cast in the first place. And even more so to see a Western that falls into that area is kind of shocking. As I've talked about in some previous videos, and I definitely recommend you go watch those if you haven't already. Some of my previous videos about other Western films. The Western genre is almost at its core. It's almost by definition extremely white and extremely male. And I won't rehash all my points about the genre as a whole, but it almost has to be white and male in its traditional structure, because it fulfills a very specific sort of pro-American propagandistic function in art and cinema and historical revisionism. And that is by design, for a whole bunch of reasons, both cinematically and historical narratively. But this really renews my interest in a different way, because part of my exploration here of the Western genre that I've sort of been on again and off again on has been trying to figure out if the Western can have a place in modern times, in modern cinema, in modern culture, and modern narratives. And this movie tells me that yes, there is a place for Westerns again, but it needs to make big pivots in a lot of ways that might upset Western traditionalists, but are really interesting in terms of how significant they seem when really it is a small change that completely recontextualizes an otherwise very traditional Western narrative. So I'm going to try not to talk about the plot, because the course of the plot is very traditional in most of its arc, but has some unique takes on it that are really important as to why this movie is good, or part of why the movie is so good. It's got a lot of good things going for it. So it's going to be really hard for me to not talk about it because it's going to make my arguments a lot less convincing. Maybe I'll talk about it at the end. We'll see. So what is particularly interesting is both in modernizing this narrative and making it a non-white narrative, it takes a lot of very traditional Western elements and turns them just enough to let you look at them in a different way that recontextualizes the whole story very substantially, I think. I think that's what's most interesting about it in a lot of ways. Story-wise, this is a very traditional story in terms of even mashing up several different kinds of Western narratives, including things like the traditional revenge story, the sort of Western heist, the old bank robbers and versus lawmen type of thing, while also incorporating some of the later inclusions to the Western genre that were a little bit more towards things like the gray hat hero, the hero who is on the wrong side of the law but still heroic or even anti-heroic in their structure. And there is an inherent part of the changes that are made that is due to the cast, or due to, or at least possible because the cast is almost entirely black or almost entirely non-white, I should say, for the entire run of the film. Now, not to delve too deep into like historical revisionism and stuff like that, but in traditional American public school education and American historical narratives in general, the Western period, and I'm going to say that's all the way from like the early 1800s to the early 1900s. It's almost 100 years worth of really Western expansion. Both the cinematic narratives that are portrayed in the Western genre and the historical portrayal that is made in education and general knowledge among Americans is one that is profoundly white and male. But the reality of the time period, though much less documented, was that it included a very substantial amount of non-white immigrants out of the East and the South and into these new lands. In a very like core economic sense, the reason for Western expansion by so many people was usually not it was not the wealthy, it was not the industrialists, at least by the numbers, that were moving out to the West. It was people looking for new opportunities or old things to get away from. And that is kind of universal across Western history and the Western stories, is the people who were going out there were largely those who needed to get away from something or to get something new. And throughout the entire period of that Western expansion, that means there's a whole lot of people who are non-white who really need to get away from something, whether that's literally getting away from slavery or native peoples who were being extracted from their lands and forcibly removed and just told you can't be here, you have to go somewhere else. Or if it's the people who are already in the Western areas, whether that's other Native Americans or Native and Spanish people who had already been established in Central South America, who had migrated up and down and established places out in the West. the West did not look nearly as white in many places as the historical narrative says it was. And so to have this movie start on a black screen that says these people existed, I think is a really important reminder in a very upfront but honestly surprisingly subtle way of saying, don't forget there were other people here too. And the movie does not hit you over the head with any aspect of its non-whiteness really at any point. It's not proselytizing. It's not trying to speak to, to these things I'm talking about. It's not trying to say all the time, we were black and we were there, or we were native and we were there. It is incidental, really, their non-whiteness. And the only time it comes into play and is commented on directly is a few specific cases where the whiteness of some people or some areas is specifically relevant to the plot. Whether it's we need to go to the white town and they don't like us because we're not white, because obviously that was just what it was like in the era. Those are the only sort of things that come up and make it super notable that the non-whiteness of the cast is so relevant. That said, there's subtle things that go throughout and really lend to the specific narrative they end up telling. While the narrative is very traditional and having these sort of, cowboy characters and gray area and not so gray heroes and villains, the story and the sort of the thing that's really trying to be said is much less about the Western and much more about the individual people. It's less about the concept of the West and more about the individuals who were there and their struggles and their experiences and the things that they saw and were subjected to and were forced to do and chose for themselves, which are not always the focuses, and more often than not really focused or even noted in the Western genre. In the Western genre, most things tend to be sort of inevitable. It is a very highly structured genre that tends to, you sort of already know how things are usually going to work out. There might be setbacks, there might be these sorts of things, but the character development and the interrogation of an individual and their motivations and experiences is not what Westerns do very often. It's not completely absent by any means. Certainly I've talked about a few movies that touch on those things and use them in certain ways, but they're still about the concept of the West at a higher level. This movie focuses much more on the individual experiences, the past, the present, and the future of those individuals, and the specific places they are in and the people that they know and have to interact with and conflict with. And that is what makes this way more interesting to me as a Western genre adaptation. I think somewhere in the middle of the movie, I was watching this and going, I'm not sure this is a Western. It uses the framework of the Western. It uses the setting. It uses all these other things that are tradition to a Western. But there's so much of despite these things being kind of minor in their pivoting, it can change the feel of the Western so much that it's a little bit sort of up in the air. And obviously they're all classifications that are completely arbitrary. It's easy to say this belongs in this category, this doesn't, and you can make all kinds of arguments. But to me, this does come around to being a very modernized Western. I love the narrative that they have here, and while the non-whiteness of it adds a certain credence to the stories they end up telling, and the specific events that go on. There's no reason that this is not a white story, or it's specifically a black story, or something like that. This is a very approachable, very understandable sort of narrative, while also commenting on, both the historicity and the current importance of its themes. And I'm going to avoid saying any more until probably right at the end, because I think what they do with it is really, really smart. So before I get into that, let me just point out say a few things about the more general production. I love the way this movie is shot. I think the cinematography is often really, really good. It's got some great choreography for certain fight scenes and things like that. It uses some great framing. There's some really impressive camera work shots as well, including one zoom shot that I genuinely don't know how they did. It's possible it was on a dolly car, but I can't imagine how they did it. It's very impressive. And just a lot of really smart cinematography. It's also beautiful. And I talk all the time, this shouldn't be as shocking as it is, but it is shocking how nice this movie is to look at in basically every scene. We have a lot of movies of all kinds of genres these days that are looking very muddy, very desaturated, very kind of unpleasant to look at. And the Western genre and its more modern adaptations are no exception. In fact, they may be some of the most significant perpetrators of this right after like modern war movies, because the West is often looked at as very sort of dirty and grimy and sort of everybody's disheveled and whatnot. And that wasn't untrue, but that doesn't mean there can't be beauty to it and there can't be color and liveliness. And so this is a film that uses color very effectively to both beautify the shots in general and make them visually engaging, but also to do certain types of storytelling, whether that's the colors of paint being used on a building or the lack thereof in certain circumstances, or the clothing that is being worn by people to indicate either a certain amount of wealth or lack of wealth, or ability to buy, fancy things, and generally show a certain level of prosperity for themselves or for their building or for a whole town or something like that. So color is used both as a narrative thing and as just a cinematic appeal thing. That said, all of that could go to waste if it wasn't shot properly, but it's shot really, really well. They do not over post-process this. It's certainly, at least not to tune down the color. If anything, they may be tuning the color up in post-processing, and I don't think that's a problem at all. And in addition to all that, I think it's particularly notable how good the people are shot. Now, this is a whole topic all its own, one that I am in many ways not entirely qualified to talk about, but it's super important for me to point this out, I think. Hollywood does not know how to shoot black skin. Like, the amount of very talented non-white actors on screen in very high budget productions who do not look right because a combination of the skills of the direction, the skills of the editing, and the actual technical use of equipment does not show non-white people visually well. And I think the most, to use a super approachable version of this, there was a big controversy some years ago now about how, I don't remember if it was the iPhone or something came out, A new iPhone came out, claimed it had an amazing camera, and then people took pictures of non-white people, and everybody went, "Why can't this? Why does your amazing camera not shoot black people properly?" And that's a very real issue because there's a certain, for want of a better phrase, racism to technology when the people who make it are not thinking about people who may not look like themselves, probably don't look like themselves. They may not even consider the appearance of the people on the other end of the camera. And there are a lot of people, otherwise very talented people, in the cinema industry who shoot incredibly talented, important actors, and they look bad because nobody knew how to make them look good. And this movie does the exact opposite. This is an incredible movie for dark skin tones. It looks amazing. The people look so alive, and the warmth of their of everything going on, but especially the liveliness of the skin tones is so important. Now, again, I'm not the most qualified person to talk on this subject. There are plenty of other people on YouTube who have talked about this. So please go watch one of them instead. But I think it requires specific note because this movie would have been much less if the people on the screen were not shown in such beauty the way they are in this film. So special props to everybody involved in making sure that the people looked as great as they do. Now, stepping away from that, I just really needed to talk about that because I think it's really important and often overlooked. Other production aspects of the film. The general cinematography, as I said, is really good. The sets, the costuming, all these things, the makeup, everything looks fantastic. There are certain elements of it that are a little bit more cartoonish, things that are actually, I think I would say, sort of dipping into not quite Hong Kong action, but the kind of things where they're taking influence from certain action genres and being willing to apply a certain level of unreality to physics, to biology, to these other things, to make it a more compelling and emotionally engaging narrative. These are all used to really good effect. Like I said, the plot's already sort of very traditional, but some of its twists and turns and the ways that its resolutions are executed are very non-traditional and work to really good effect. And in addition to all the visual aspects, the sound editing is very, very well done, and the music is of particular note. This is not using, well, this has a great soundtrack. It is in a lot of ways very non-traditional to a Western, but in other points it does integrate sort of Western sound, a traditional Western sound into it. But mostly it's a very different kind of take on the soundtrack, but works really, really well. And this is something that I've been seeing a little bit more and more as there's more modern Westerns and more adaptations to genre in general in the last 10 to 15 years. And I think it's hard not to compare at some level this movie to something like Django Unchained for a whole bunch of reasons. But the use of Western tropes while adapting narratively, visually, auditorily those tropes into a more modern setting and a more approachable for adapting those things in a way that makes them not super traditionally Western and not super traditionally Western audience focused, let's put it that way, makes this a great twist. There are one or two songs that I think are maybe a little bit too much, that are maybe a little excessive for the scenes that they are in, but are still really well produced, sound great, and add to the overall adaptation of the genre. Is there anything else I want to talk about before I get into the plot? I don't think so. I think this is a really great film for a whole bunch of reasons, and I'm going to touch on sort of what caps the whole thing off for me. So if you haven't watched the film yet, I'm kind of going to spoil a twist a little bit here. So please go check this out. I think it's a great film and very worth your time watching. Okay, so the sort of final aspect of this that is sort of lurking subtly throughout the entire film and then comes to a head right near the end is this narrative of this revenge story. And the revenge story is very front and center throughout the entire film, and it looks like a very traditional Western revenge story where an outlaw killed your family and you're coming to sort of get your revenge. I mean, there's no other way to put it, I guess. There are little nods throughout the entire film that say things about the genre adaptation that is happening and give you a nod towards what it might do later. And this gets into a particularly Black American post, well, not even necessarily post-slavery, because I don't know when this is set. But, you know, the historical aspect of slavery in this film is very front and center, but is commented on less directly a lot of the time. It's, we don't have opportunities because the other people out here, we have to basically keep to our own because everybody else out here is worse. Even if there are people in our community that we don't like or can't deal with, we have to, because engaging with white people is basically will end with us losing everything we have, including probably our lives. So when at the very beginning of the film, we have this violence, this act of extreme violence between two of our main characters. I guess I'm still sort of dancing around trying not to say exactly what happens. I don't know. We have this act of violence between these two main characters, and it's hard to figure out why exactly it happens. And right at the end of the film, we find out why. And it is not what I expected at all, and I think it is fantastically executed, because upon reflection, it points to so many other things that happen earlier in the film, not in terms of their plot necessarily, but in terms of what it was trying to say the whole time. And really, the thing that I got out of it is that this whole movie is very much about isolated communities and generational trauma. And this is not unique by any means to the pre-slavery or post-slavery world, or to Black people in America, or to any race or any, anything specific. This is a much more universal thing. But in the specific context of this movie, what it is in many ways saying is that the historical pain of slavery and the things that Black people were forced to endure and were forced to do for themselves and to each other as a result of being ostracized by the rest of the white part of the United States, basically the rest of the United States, really put people individuals into horrible situations where they just had to do their best, and their best was barely surviving a lot of the time. It's also a commentary on the way that forces the people who, the power structures to be internalized to that community, where the menace to good, well-meaning Black people who are trying to make their way, the menace is not just the white outsiders, it is other Black people within the community they're living in who are not, who are extracting their will, who are exerting their power on other Black people, on other people within this already marginalized community, making them marginalia of marginalia, basically. And the ultimate reveal at the end of the film that the whole crux of the movie and the whole crux of this revenge story was about looking for resolution to pain that characters never got resolution to when they needed it, and how that caused more pain. The lack of that resolution caused a perpetuation of that pain. That is a very universal experience. I think that's a discussion that a lot more people are having, of all stripes, of all races, of all colors, of all generations even, but are particularly in the millennial and younger generation, or Gen X, I would say, in younger generation. This discussion that we're having as a culture about historical trauma and the fighting against the tendency to perpetuate your own the things in your own community or the things in your own family, the fight against those temptations, the fight to not follow in the footsteps of the bad things that have happened to you. And maybe you, as a listener, have your own attachment to a narrative like this. I know I certainly do. Of being able to say, I'm not going to do those things that were done to me. I'm not going to let those things happen again. And I'm going to stand up for the things that prevent that historical trauma from being perpetuated. But compared to a lot of the conversations we're having these days, that narrative is much more directly on, it's much more real with the reality of, hey, I was a slave, or my parents were slaves, and everything was against us. That makes it very tangible. The historical trauma is very tangible when you were literally not allowed to be a person a few years ago. I guess I don't have a final conclusion on that, other than to say it's a super interesting twist on the narrative and recontextualizes the whole film in a way I think makes the whole thing even more interesting to watch, probably a second time, which I will probably end up doing. I think this film is really great. I think it shows just one of many ways that the Western genre can be adapted to talk about more modern narratives and focus on things that are more culturally relevant in our current time, while also showing how, in certain ways, things haven't changed and might never change, or might take a very long time to make the changes we expect. Anyway, apparently there's a car outside. Apologies for that. I think that's basically the summation of all my thoughts on this. I really like this film. I think it's really, really good. And for it's got a, I don't think I even talked about this. The cast is really, really good. There's some great acting throughout this entire film. And I believe this is the director's first, is their directorial debut. And I really am curious what they will make next, because I think this is fantastic in so many ways. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.